Well, as a little boy, I looked so forward to going to church on Sunday because I was going to see all my little friends I wouldn't see during the week. I'd get to see them on Sunday. So I wanted to go over there as early as I could so I'd have more time to play. But it never mattered how early we got to church. Always came the time I dreaded. That's the time we had to go in. Now, it wasn't that I didn't believe the preacher. I did. I knew he was talking about folks that were real because my daddy had read to me all about those folks. I knew they'd been real. I knew they were heroes. But see, they were dead. And they had been dead for hundreds of years. And I had that all mixed up in my head. I just couldn't relate to it. Go and sit in that building for 2 hours Sunday morning and listen to that man talk about dead folks that's been dead for hundreds of years. And I just couldn't relate to that. So it really, truly got to be like torture. Besides, there wasn't a single place in that church or that furniture you had to sit on that you'd get comfortable enough to go to sleep. And even if you did, the preacher preached so loud he'd keep you awake. So it really was like torture to sit in that church. Now, this was during the Great Depression. Country people didn't have any money to buy material to build a building or even to buy the land to put it on. Somebody donated 3 acres of land to this little church that was organized. And on that 3 acres of land was a stand of old loblolly pine. Loblolly pine is the hardest pine wood in the world. Well, they cut down those old pine trees and they skinned the bark off them. They stacked them up in a log cabin, and they called it a church building. Some of the other logs they sent over to the sawmill and had them cut up 1x4 strips, brought them back with a hammer and nail. They nailed them together. Now that was the pews you had to sit on. Loblolly pine, the hardest wood in the world. The older it got, the harder it got. Besides that, they left a half-inch crack right down the middle. Now, when you sit on that, you kept one eye on your neighbor. If he got up, you better get up too. That's just the way it was. So it really was no place you could get comfortable in that church. All that changed one Sunday when I was 12 years old. An old itinerant preacher came to our church that Sunday. He preached a sermon that would forever alter the course of my life. I never realized it that morning when we got up and hurried over to the little church. We had about 2 hours. All of the little boys went down in the woods to play. And when we heard the bell ring, that meant we had to come in. So we all came in. But like all little boys, I brought my body indoors, but I left my mind outside. I went immediately to take my favorite seat in church. Now, I don't know if you ever had a favorite seat in church or not, but I did. Mine was on the back row, just as far away from the front as I could get, mainly because my mama sat on the front row, and she had the best ears of anybody in that church. Sometimes I declare she could hear me cross my legs all the way in the back of that room. But it never mattered what kind of noise Mama heard coming from that back room. I can't ever remember seeing her turn her head and look back. She didn't have to do that. All she had to do was stick that finger up and wiggle it like that. That meant a whipping when you get home. And she didn't forget. See, my mama was something else. When she said frogs, you better jump, because she meant it, Well, I came in, I took my seat back there, and looking straight forward, just like I was paying attention, but I wasn't. My mind was wandering over those hills and valleys, wondering how long it's going to be before that preacher would let us get out of there. I really thought I was going to starve to death every Sunday before I could hear him say amen. But this Sunday, we had an old itinerant preacher. Of course, I never paid any attention to that. I thought it was going to be the same old routine, so I wasn't paying any attention to him. Till I heard a word I'd never heard before. And then I heard another one. And then I decided to collect my thoughts and tune in on that man. He was talking about something I never heard of. He wasn't talking about dead folks anymore. He was talking about a place he called hell. And the longer he talked, the brighter picture he painted for me with his words of a place of everlasting punishment. Now, he was on a subject I could relate to. He was talking about punishment. And every 12-year-old boy can relate to punishment, you know. I said, Lord, could this be real? What this man's talking about, could this be real? If this is real, I don't want any part of it. I'll do whatever I got to do. Just don't let me have any part in whatever it is this man's talking about. When that sermon was over, that preacher gave an invitation. I was the first one down that aisle. Didn't walk around. On that day, as a 12-year-old boy, I gave my life to this God my father loved so very much. However, I have to confess, I did not know this God like my father knew him, but I knew my father. Besides being my father, he was my very best friend. I wanted to please him with my life. Besides, that preacher had literally scared it out of me. So growing up in that little community, I tried to live a life that was acceptable to this God and was pleasing to my Father. Well, you know how time itself has a way of changing things. They brought in the power lines. The little rural community began to fade away as modernization began to set in. They even tore down the old log building. They built a new and modern brick building. But basically, the fellowship remained the same fine country folk they'd always been. I remember going to that little church as a young adult, barely out of my teens, telling those people that God had called me to be a preacher. Well, they accepted my word for it and licensed me to preach, gave me a license to preach the gospel. Just about that time, war broke out. Well, you know how it is in wartime. My government insisted that I volunteer my service. So I had to go away and serve in the Army for a while. I came back, true to my word. I was going to keep my commitment. I went to that little church and told them I'm carrying out my commitment. So they ordained me a minister of the gospel. Then I went away and enrolled in college, the most difficult undertaking of my entire life. I didn't realize how tough it was going to be to go back to school. I'd been out for a long time. But you know, I wasn't over that college a full day before I realized they wasn't giving anything away over there. It required the burning of the midnight oil just to maintain a passing grade. Well, I'd rationalized within myself, hey, if you're going to be a preacher, surely it's worth all the struggle and sacrifice. So I struggled and sacrificed for about 2 years. I finally reached a place I decided I'd enjoyed all that sacrifice I could stand. So I up and quit. Went to the city of New Orleans, country boy going to town. Got down there, I started a career that was going to last me for over 26 years. I served with the New Orleans Police Department, the Louisiana State Police Department, and on detached service with the Baltimore, Maryland Police Department, serving every level of law enforcement from the uniformed officer on the beat throughout the ranks and chain of command. But the 26 years I served in law enforcement, I never forgot my Christian faith. I continued to practice it daily as I believed it. I was even given an opportunity to continue my Christian education. So the first 6 years I served as a uniformed police officer for the city of New Orleans. I served on a night shift voluntarily so that I could go to school during the daytime. There was one solid year there where I was working full-time as a uniformed police officer during the night. During the daytime, I was a full-time student at the seminary. Same time I pastored the church full-time. Same time I maintained a full-time Christian radio program. Didn't have too many spare moments that year. I always carried a little portable PA system in the trunk of my automobile. And when I would find myself off duty on Saturdays, I would take that as my mission day. I would travel around to the little towns and villages surrounding the city of New Orleans where it was not against the law to preach in the court square, and set up my PA system in the court square and preach to the passerbyers. Or if the weather didn't permit, just find a place somewhere where you could stand out of the weather and hand out tracts to passerbyers, or find a jail somewhere where you could go and hold service with the prisoners. After all, these kind of things are only our reasonable duties.